Prague, 1890s. Before Franz Kafka ever wrote a word, he learned to listen for footsteps in the hallway, not out of curiosity but fear. His father, Hermann Kafka, was a man of impressive stature, overbearing, self-made, loud. He had clawed his way out of poverty in a Czech shtetl and become a successful merchant in Prague. To everyone else, he was a symbol of strength and perseverance. To Franz, he was a tyrant in a waistcoat. "Recently you asked me why I claimed to be afraid of you," Franz would write decades later. "As usual, I could not think of any answer at the time. Now I will try to answer you in writing." But that answer, 1003 pages long, would not come until after a lifetime of silent humiliation. This is not the story of a writer. This is the story of a child who never escaped his father's shadow. It began in the nursery. Kafka was a sickly, sensitive boy, quiet, thin, introspective, the opposite of everything his father admired. Hermann Kafka, a man who walked into rooms and expected them to fall silent, didn't know what to make of his son, so he made him into nothing. At night, Kafka would be left crying in his crib while his father yelled from the next room to shut that noise. At dinner, his voice was drowned out by jokes, mockery, and orders. Once, when Franz begged for water after bedtime, Hermann dragged him to the window and locked him out on the freezing balcony in his nightshirt. The message was clear: feeling was weakness, weakness was failure, and failure deserved punishment. Years later, Kafka would recall this moment in the letter. "I stood outside, banging and crying, for who knows how long. That was only a small episode, but the impression it made on me was enormous." Inside that apartment in Prague, surrounded by heavy furniture and heavier silences, Franz Kafka began to vanish. He didn't rebel, he retreated. Books became his refuge. Observation became his defense mechanism. He learned to see the world from a distance because closeness had always meant danger. At school he was an excellent student, polite, invisible. He excelled in literature, but when he expressed a desire to study German and philosophy, his father rejected it as useless. Law school was non-negotiable. Hermann didn't just pay for his education, he dictated it. Kafka obeyed. He always obeyed. The contrast was complete. His father loud, physical, socially dominant. Franz silent, cerebral, shrinking. At family gatherings, Hermann held court while Franz sat in silence. Any attempt at expression was met with ridicule or dismissal. "You are naturally eloquent," Franz wrote in the letter. "You have the true rhetoric of a tyrant." Kafka did not invent his themes in fiction. They were born at that dinner table. Authority that can't be reasoned with, guilt without crime, punishment without cause. It wasn't metaphor, it was autobiography. The damage ran deep. Kafka developed a lifelong belief that he was unworthy of love, incapable of normal life, and doomed to disappoint anyone who came close. He avoided intimacy, panicked at engagement, and sabotaged relationships with precision. He once wrote to a friend, "Coitus as punishment for the happiness of being together." To Kafka, even joy carried guilt, but he didn't confront his father, not with words. Instead, he wrote stories about being crushed by unnamed authorities, characters turning into insects, men accused but never told why. He never said father out loud, but his entire body of work is haunted by the man. The name Kafka would one day define a literary universe of anxiety and absurdity, but to Franz, it meant something much simpler. Kafka was the man whose approval he never earned, whose shadow he never escaped, whose voice echoed in every silence. In 1919, Franz Kafka finally sat down to write his father, not to argue, not to attack, but to explain, to try, one last time to be understood. What came out was 103 pages of desperation. Letter to his father was not meant for publication. It was not meant to be read aloud. It was meant to be survived. And though Kafka never sent the letter, its weight would finish the work his father started. The boy who feared the man would become the man who feared himself. Franz Kafka didn't grow up believing he would be a writer. He grew up believing he was a disappointment. Writing wasn't a dream, it was an escape route. By the time he entered law school in 1901, his father's choice, not his own, Kafka had already discovered what it felt like to disappear onto the page. Not to express himself, but to survive himself. Words gave him control over a world that otherwise crushed him. In stories, he wasn't Hermann Kafka's son. He was the judge, the accused, the insect, the ghost. He could finally speak. At home he wrote at night, alone, after everyone had gone to bed. During the day he put on the proper mask, obedient son, diligent law student, respectable insurance clerk. But behind that mask, he bled ink. "Writing is a form of prayer," he once said. He didn't write for applause, he feared it. He feared being seen, because if people saw him, they might see what his father saw, a failure pretending to be a man. His professional life was a performance. Kafka spent most of his adult life working for the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute in Prague. He hated the job, but he was good at it. He was organized, thoughtful, meticulous. His reports were praised, but he never gave the company more than the bare minimum. He saved his real effort for the night. My strength is limited. The office is a horror. The apartment is noisy. And if a pleasant, straight life is not possible, then one must try to wriggle through by subtle maneuvers. Writing became that maneuver, his way of staying alive without being truly present. By day, he observed. By night, he created. But even in his stories, Kafka couldn't escape himself. The protagonists of his fiction are not heroes. They are men on trial, vermin in bed, wanderers lost in labyrinths. They're trapped, just like he was. When the Metamorphosis was published in 1915, readers were stunned. A man turns into a giant insect and is locked in his room by his family. They feed him scraps. They hide him from visitors. They're embarrassed by his existence. It was surreal, unbelievable. And yet, it was exactly how Franz felt. Writing did not heal him. It revealed him. In story after story, his obsessions returned, guilt without explanation, authority without compassion, yearning for intimacy, crushed by self-loathing. He wrote about law, but never justice, about love, but never fulfillment, about transformation, but always toward death, not freedom. Critics would later call it existentialism. But to Kafka, it was autobiography in disguise. All I am, he wrote, is literature, and I am not even that. Women entered his life, but only so far. He fell in love often, with Felice Bauer, with Melina Jesenska, with Dora Diamant. Each time he dreamed of closeness, each time he recoiled from it. Engagements were broken, letters went unanswered, he begged for understanding, then ran from it. His lovers became witnesses to a man divided against himself. Felice once described their relationship as a tragedy in installments. Kafka agreed. I cannot make anyone happy, he told her, not even myself. His father haunted every moment. Even when not present, Hermann's voice echoed in Kafka's head. When Franz dared to love, the voice whispered, "You're not a man." When he tried to assert himself, it boomed, "You're weak, you're sick, you're nothing." Kafka believed it. He lived between pages because he couldn't survive in rooms. He made his pain into prose because he didn't know how to speak it aloud. His work was never about success, it was about endurance. I write differently from what I speak differently from what I think differently from how I should think, and so on to infinity. By the time he turned 35, Kafka had written some of the most haunting fiction of the 20th century, but he had published little. He felt ashamed of it all. His health had begun to fail. Tuberculosis slowly stole his breath. His relationships fell apart. His body withered. His voice faded. And then, at his lowest point, he returned to the origin of it all. He picked up his pen and wrote, not a story, but a letter, not fiction, not metaphor, to his father. Prague, November 1919. Franz Kafka sits alone at his desk. Outside, the city hums with post-war uncertainty, but inside this small room the only sound is a pen scratching paper. He is 36 years old, his lungs already weakened by tuberculosis, his engagement to Julie Warizek collapsing, his body failing, his spirit brittle. And for the first time in his life, he is preparing to confront the one force that defined him more than any illness, lover or book ever could, his father. The document begins timidly. You asked me recently why I maintain that I am afraid of you, but the politeness is a mask. Within a few sentences, the dam breaks. What follows is not a letter, it is an autopsy of a childhood, a case file of emotional brutality, a desperate plea for recognition, written in the formal tone of a lawyer defending a condemned man himself. Kafka lists every humiliation, every threat, every word that carved itself into his bones, the balcony incident, the shouting, the silence heavier than fists, the towering figure who turned a sensitive child into a witness of his own life. You have the true rhetoric of a tyrant, he writes. You were an overwhelming force for me. No anger, no curses, just sorrow sharpened into precision. The letter fills 103 handwritten pages. Hours stretch into days. Kafka eats little, sleeps less. His chest aches with every breath, but he keeps writing. As if every stroke of the pen might lift a weight from his lungs. He does not accuse his father of crimes, he accuses him of being himself. This is what makes the document devastating. Kafka is not raging, he is begging to be understood. I needed encouragement, a little kindness, a little affection. Instead, I was crushed by your strength. The tone is almost childlike, not in simplicity but in naked vulnerability. A grown man trying to reclaim a voice he never had permission to develop. He describes dinners as tribunals, childhood punishments as psychological executions. His father, in his view, is not a monster, he is worse, a giant too large to notice what he destroyed. Kafka does not hate him, he fears him, he worships him, he never stopped trying to please him, and never succeeded. Before you, I had no will of my own. Every sentence tightens the narrative. Kafka's failures, anxieties, sexual insecurity, loneliness, all traced to the same origin. He believes he is incapable of marriage because his father convinced him he was unworthy of love. He believes he is unfit for life because his father defined strength as domination and feeling as weakness. It is a psychological map of a man who never grew into himself because he spent his entire life shrinking to survive. And yet beneath the sorrow lies something more tragic: hope. Kafka does not write to condemn, he writes to heal. He writes because some part of him still believes reconciliation might be possible, that truth might open a door sealed for decades. When he finishes, he hands the letter to his mother. Unable to deliver it directly, she reads it quietly, then makes a decision that seals the fate of both men. She does not give it to Hermann Kafka. Why? Because she knows the truth. Hermann would laugh or rage, he would never understand it. Never take responsibility, never see weakness as anything but contemptible. Kafka will never know whether his father read even a sentence. The document is returned to him, unread, untouched, unacknowledged. The letter that was meant to free him becomes one more secret to carry. It breaks something inside him. He had gathered every memory, every humiliation, every trembling fear into a final act of courage, and it vanished into silence. From that moment, Kafka stops believing he can ever escape his father's shadow. Not through confrontation, not through art, not through love. The unsent letter becomes a tombstone, not for the father he never understood, but for the son he never became. He once wrote, "In the struggle between you and the world, back the world, but in the struggle between Franz Kafka and Hermann Kafka, there was never a world to retreat into, only pages, and pain, and a silence so deep it swallowed him whole." Franz Kafka wanted love. He longed for closeness, tenderness, a shared life that might finally silence the echo of his father's voice. But every time he reached out his hand, his own mind pulled it back. Intimacy triggered anxiety. Desire awakened guilt. Love felt like something he wasn't allowed to receive, or worse, something he would only ruin by touching. What have I in common with Jews? I hardly have anything in common with myself. Kafka, in a letter to Max Brod. The women in Kafka's life were not illusions. They were real, passionate, intelligent, alive. Felicie Bauer, Milena Jusenska, Dora Diamant. Each relationship began with promise. Letters filled with intensity and devotion. Kafka could be playful, generous, even romantic, at a distance. But the moment physical closeness became real, his fear returned. Felicie Bauer was his first engagement and his first escape. She was practical, reliable, a Berlin office worker who seemed to Kafka like the anchor he needed. They exchanged hundreds of letters. Kafka obsessed over her replies. He imagined their life together, even as he dreaded its reality. When the wedding was proposed, he panicked. He wrote to her of his fears, his illnesses, his inability to live as a husband. She was stunned. "What shall I do with this letter?" she asked. "Laugh or cry?" They were engaged, then unengaged, then engaged again, then unengaged again. Kafka couldn't commit, not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much to risk destroying it. "I'm made of literature," he wrote to her, "and I'm not good for anything else." He didn't see himself as a man. He saw himself as a disease, one that would infect anyone who got too close. Milena Jusenska came next, a fiery, married Czech journalist who began translating his work. She understood him instantly. She called him a soul brother. He responded with letters that burned with intensity and admiration. But Milena was not his, and perhaps that was why he allowed himself to love her. They met only twice. The distance, the impossibility, protected Kafka from his deepest fear, that love might demand a body. He once told her that his greatest desire was to sleep beside her, but without touching. "I have never been able to hold my own in life," he wrote. "I have never been able to hold anyone." Dora Diamant was the last. A young teacher from Berlin, passionate about Yiddish culture, she met Kafka in 1923, when his illness was in full decline. With her, he tried something new. He moved in. They lived together for nearly a year. Poor, uncertain, but close. He wrote fewer letters. He spent more time in parks than on pages. Dora cooked for him, read to him, loved him, and he let her. But by then his lungs were collapsing. He coughed blood. He couldn't swallow food. He was starving, not from lack of nourishment, but from pain. "My last request," he whispered from his hospital bed, "kill me, or I'll die." His illness was more than physical. Kafka had tuberculosis of the larynx, but the real disease lived deeper. He once described sex as punishment, marriage as a lie that two people tell themselves. He believed his body was repulsive, that he would be exposed, judged, and humiliated, just like in childhood, just like by his father. The trauma had rewired his nervous system, affection triggered panic, security felt like a trap. He wrote, "My body is too long for its weakness. I belong nowhere." His writing reflected this internal collapse. In the trial, Joseph K. is arrested for a crime he never understands. He is tried, sentenced, and executed, without explanation. He dies like a man who never had a voice. In the castle, K. tries to reach an authority he cannot access, in a place that shifts under his feet. He dies seeking answers from a world that doesn't even acknowledge the question. In the Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa wakes up as an insect, and is hidden, despised, and discarded by his family. It ends with his death and their relief. These weren't metaphors, they were confessions in code. Kafka did not die from lack of love. He died because love couldn't reach the part of him that was broken. He had been trained from the age of 4 to believe that feeling was weakness, that silence was safety, that love, if allowed, would only end in pain. He once wrote to Melina, "You are the knife I turn inside myself." His women loved him, but he did not know how to be loved, because somewhere deep inside, the child on the balcony still stood in the cold, waiting for his father to open the door. Vienna, June 3, 1924. A frail man lies in a clinic bed. He weighs less than 100 pounds. He hasn't spoken in days. He can no longer swallow food. The pain in his throat is so severe that even water feels like fire. He is dying of tuberculosis of the larynx. But tuberculosis is not what truly killed him. Franz Kafka is 40 years old, and he is dying from something much older than the disease in his lungs. He is dying from a life of silence. His final weeks were agony. His condition made speech nearly impossible. Dora Diamant, the woman who stayed with him to the end, said he would scribble short notes to communicate. On one note he wrote, "Kill me, or I'll die." The irony was unbearable. A man whose entire life was built around the written word could no longer speak. A man who once poured 103 pages into a letter to his father could now only write 3 words. But even as his body collapsed, Kafka refused to stop observing himself. He wrote a short story in those final days, The Hunger Artist, about a man who fasts until death in a cage, ignored and misunderstood. It was the last thing he would ever write. He died soon after. He left behind a strange command. He told his friend and literary executor, Max Brod, to burn everything, every manuscript, every notebook, every scrap of fiction he had ever produced. He wanted it all gone. Brod ignored him, and because of that betrayal, the world knows Franz Kafka, not just the Metamorphosis, the trial, and the castle, but the stories he never intended to publish. The pages soaked with the slow-burning trauma of a man who never stopped trying to escape the prison of his own upbringing. Kafka's death was quiet. His impact was not. As Europe plunged into fascism, totalitarianism, and war, Kafka's fiction suddenly looked like prophecy, a man arrested without cause, a citizen crushed by a system that doesn't explain itself, a family that hides its shame behind a locked door. By the 1940s, Kafka's writing no longer seemed surreal, it seemed accurate. But while critics read political allegory, his friends knew the truth. Kafka wasn't describing a system, he was describing a father. The letter to Hermann Kafka, never sent, never answered, outlived them both. It is now one of the most studied documents in literary history. Psychologists read it as a case study in emotional trauma. Writers read it as the origin of Kafka's obsession with guilt, submission, and self-erasure. Readers feel it as something more intimate, a cry for love from someone who never believed he deserved it. In that letter, Kafka confesses, "I was crushed under the weight of your expectations. I had no will, only fear." It wasn't tuberculosis that killed him. It was decades of being told, in word and silence, that he didn't deserve to exist as he was. After his death, Kafka became a myth, a symbol of alienation. A ghost wandering bureaucratic ruins, a man turned into metaphor. But the real tragedy is more human. He was a boy who wanted his father to say just once, "You're enough." That validation never came. Instead, he wrote stories that begged the question, can someone like me live in a world like this? He never found an answer. Kafka's grave sits in the new Jewish cemetery in Prague. His name is etched in stone, quiet and modest, like the man himself. Visitors leave pens, notes, flowers, tributes not to his fame, but to the vulnerability that still speaks across time. And yet his most enduring legacy may not be his fiction, but the letter he never mailed. Letter to his father remains the rawest, most intimate document of psychological devastation in modern literature. It is not literature, it is a wound on the page. And it shows, more than any story Kafka ever wrote, what really destroyed him. Not illness, Not rejection, not obscurity, but the slow erosion of self-worth under a father's silence, a voice silenced in childhood that could only scream in fiction. He didn't die of tuberculosis, he died from never being heard.